Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. Hard to believe it's our 67th episode of doing this together. And as you know, we range all across different topics interesting to our MedTech community. These last two episodes, we have been focusing on, in partnership with our friends at MedHealth, bringing you some pertinent information to the region with respect to COVID. Today, we're going to be talking about the U.S.-Canada border. We don't normally get into nations and politics, except it's really interesting because in our region, we live really, really close to a major international border, one that's been severely disrupted by COVID. We're going to have, in a few minutes, Dr. Phillip Levy, Jeanine Lassaline-Berglund, and Zain Ismail on with me. There you can see their names. And again, this is in partnership with MedHealth, who has been a great regional partner in the MedTech space. There's our slide that you're supposed to be seeing. Dr. Levy from Wayne State University, Jeanine from Automate Canada and the Canadian Association of Mold Makers, and Zain, who is a cross-border healthcare worker who's going to share some personal anecdotes. But before that, I want to just tell you a little bit of news. That's our shows. I want to remind you about the quarterly pitch party happening in September this year. We just did it a few times already this year, and we're going to be awarding another $2,500 at the end of September to a lucky startup that will have pitched in the month prior. If you are interested, or a startup that you know is interested in becoming a part of the pitch party. Remember, it's not a pitch competition. It's a party because we can't pick winners and losers, but we can say what we like, what we don't like, and ultimately tip our hat towards one. And it's our judges that do that. Andy Rader, Dr. Nikki Kennedy, Jim Metzger, and Stacy Frankovich, who will be doing that hat tipping and commenting on the startups. So if you know of a startup that would be appropriate for this, have them send a pitch deck to pitchparty@medtechcrossroads.org. All US-based medtech companies are eligible, so we would love to see them there. Well, with that, we come to our main event today. And I'm going to stop this share before we talk about this picture, but it's a beautiful picture of a couple of skylines that are very, very close together. But before I talk about this and bring our panelists on, I'd like to welcome our friend Stacy Frankovich back to the show. Second week in a row. Stacy, welcome back to MedTech Crossroads.
Hey, Jean, always a pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm here a lot, so maybe I'll take a hiatus and leave you alone for a while.
No, we love having you here. And hey, as many folks know, and many on the show right now who have contributed over the past year and a half, we just want to get together and chat about stuff. And it's really fun when somebody reaches out and says, hey, we could partner on this. And that's what you did maybe a month and a half ago and said, hey, I think that vaccines, variants, and boosters are going to be a thing. Well, you were right, and just basically down to the week. And that was a fun show last week. And this time about something that many people don't think about in their daily lives, but many people do because they're in this community that's really international. Here in Southeast Michigan, Southwest Ontario, which MedHealth represents, this has generally been a very, very porous, very, very economically powerful border where a lot of stuff happens, and that's all been shut down, just what we're talking about today. But before we bring our guests on, Stacy, and I'll welcome you to help me welcome them, tell us just a bit more about MedHealth so everyone can make sure to hear about it.
Sure. And thank you, Jean. It's always a pleasure to partner with you and your team at Into Being and MedTech Crossroads. And you're right, we've had some really interesting internal conversations that have resulted in this two-part series that we're doing with you. And MedHealth is this regional collaboration across the border. So we do serve Southeast Michigan and Southwest Ontario. So with this extended border closing, it's been really important to try to understand the impact it is having. Now, granted, we typically work with startup companies in the medtech space. So when it comes to supply chain logistics, they're not manufacturing at large scale yet. But with the collaborations that we have across the border with health systems and with resource partners, this has been a challenge for all of us. So we here at MedHealth really want to help connect, convene, and educate folks. And that's why we're here, truly. We want to help people understand the impacts that these types of issues are having on people. And we want to really boost and inspire our innovator community to help us drive innovation that's going to increase patient access and ability and care. And all of these topics are so important. So I know I'm kind of all over the place, but this one is really, really important to MedHealth with all of our collaboration across the border. We got to get this border open. We got to be safe. We got to get our healthcare workers where they need to be and move forward. So very, very excited about this conversation.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. So I guess without further ado, why don't we welcome our guests on today. First off, we have Dr. Phillip Levy from Wayne State University, himself a veteran of our show. I think the third time, Dr. Levy. I'd like to always tell people you're very equal opportunity. When the truth makes you uncomfortable on either side, whatever that may be, it comes out of your mouth, and I just love it. So we welcome you back to the show. It's so good to have you here. One of your highlights, I know, was if you can say highlights over the last year and a half. In addition to all your professional responsibilities, I always like to mention you were a COVID czar on a movie that was shot recently.
Yeah, I know, Gene. You like that one as the high point, but no, it was really interesting. And the reason amidst the pandemic, people are getting sick, and why do this? Why work with a movie? I think it's important to get a semblance of return to normalcy when we can project that, but it's also really good for the region, to highlight we can do this safely. We know what we're doing in this area, and B, if you haven't seen it, No Sudden Move is a great movie. Steven Soderbergh is a director that really puts Detroit in a beautiful spotlight. And, for me, it was really important to make sure that Hollywood could come to Detroit, know that we have the capability and can get done the job. And at the end of the day, the city itself is the star of the show.
Yeah, what I love about it is the practicality of it, that you were applying everything you knew to do something that had to go forward and do it in a safe and effective way. So really, really cool. Welcome to the show. We'll get to you in just a second here. Next up, I want to welcome Jeanine Lassaline-Berglund. She's with Automate Canada and the Association of Canadian Mold Makers, representing Canadian business. Jeanine, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Gene. Honestly, I'm honored to be here and super excited to learn from the rest of the panelists as well.
Yeah, it's good to have you. As you and I were comparing notes, I found it really, really interesting. You are back in the day, you got your mold making certificate. I don't know if I got the term there right, but we were comparing notes and realizing that we both started out in the very, very hands-on technical world, and then have sort of moved on from there. But really good to have you here today, representing some of the history of our U.S.-Canada border and some of the economic impact that we'll be talking about. So glad to have you.
Absolutely. And I think for most of the listeners today, I think they might even be surprised. I think unless you're born and you've lived here all of your life, you probably don't even realize that there is much of a difference between the two areas. And yet, for the rest of the country, this will seem like a very unique and symbiotic relationship for sure.
Yeah, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, unless you're nearby or it affects you. But I think it's important to raise awareness. Well, and speaking of awareness and personal impact, next up I want to welcome our friend Zain Ismail, who is a cross-border worker in the healthcare industry himself. Zain, welcome to the show.
Hey, Gene, thanks for having me. And it's good to be here with the rest of the panelists. I've been crossing this border now for personal and professional reasons now for probably about 10 years, and professional for the last 5. And so cross it every day. I know it like the back of my hand, and could probably cross the Ambassador Bridge with my eyes closed if I tried.
We don't recommend it normally.
Yeah,
we
no,
recommend
not.
keeping the eyes open when we're driving over the bridge and having all the necessary paperwork. But yeah, no, we hear you. That's awesome. Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here. And I think what I want to start is with Jeanine, because like we said, a lot of people don't know the history. Now, I had the opportunity ever since I was a kid to go down to Detroit. I saw the border, went over a few times, honestly not that many, back in the days when you could pretty much just drive across. Mm-hmm. And I got to watch as that region grew. I mean, when I was a kid, it wasn't clear that Detroit was, and the Detroit-Windsor region was like, the greatest place in the world. It had sort of a reputation. And then over the years, I've watched that grow and excel. I remember in some of the early days of our own business, I found myself driving down there and going, wow, I'm going there because there are opportunities there. was like, whoa, that's really cool. Detroit and this region is going in the right place. And I remember asking a client of ours one time from the Bay Area. I said, when you think of this region, what's the first thing you think of? Trying to figure out if I would get a positive or a negative response. And they said, Shinola. I was like, okay, I guess we're doing good. So we're heading in the right direction. But this is a place that has known economic thriving. It's known economic setback. We've done this routine before. But let's go to Jeanine first, and then I'd welcome others to contribute if you have things on this topic. Jeanine, tell us a little bit about the history of this U.S.-Canada border. We can focus on Detroit-Windsor, but there are also other border crossings in the region. Tell us about some of the history of this.
Well, I think for all intents and purpose, the best way that I can probably describe this is being a little kid and in the back seat of my parents' car and going across the border. And I remember having a tremendously difficult time wrapping my head around the fact that we had to stop and talk to these officials. And we had to be very, very quiet. I remember my dad saying, all the time, once we get to the border, okay, no one talk. I'm the only one who talks. And I think a clever border official once asked, and this might have been the 60s, he once asked, and where are you from? And I think I blurted out the farm and everybody started laughing, but that was the end of the conversation and away we went. And I think back to those days and it felt like having to stop and have a discussion with a border official because we were traveling to another country was little more of a formality than it was a necessity back in those days. So people, I think for generations, through settlement, through the 1800s, through early wars like the War of 1812, they've traveled freely between this border without giving much thought that you were entering one country versus another. And certainly over the years, we've seen continued, let's say, formality and continued importance of making sure that records are being kept and there's protection at the border, not unlike what we see today. Certainly, border officials have their hands full now when it comes to a major global pandemic and how they protect the border. It's not also a secret to many folks in the area that, aside from the relationships and the families that have settled in this region on both sides of the border, continue to call both the Windsor and Detroit area home. This is not unique to this area. Certainly any place in Ontario that I'm aware of with a border crossing shares some of those similar attributes. But for the Windsor area specifically, since we're going to talk a little bit about the border interruption, this has been a joint cultural development exercise over the years. It's been a joint economy exercise over the years. We've seen multiple industries have a birth on both sides of the border. The border. The one that probably will be most prevalent to us is the automotive industry, but it's not alone because certainly healthcare is up there as well. In the 1960s, there was the auto pact between what I'm going to call the traditional big three, which saw Chrysler, Ford, and GM sign notes of understanding that people could cross freely across the border. And it was really the beginning of what I would call NAFTA in the early days, and understanding the free trade agreement and how people and parts could cross the border in order to support one large industry. And I think that for some, they'll hear more formal terms like an amalgamation or conurbation. Those are two terms that formal studies really coin this area as, and there aren't that many in the world that exist. And the Windsor-Detroit border crossing specifically is the busiest border crossing in North America, both by incidence and by value of goods that cross.
I was just looking at the data that says, and this may have changed during COVID somewhat, but just the Ambassador Bridge, that's not counting the tunnel, it's not counting other border crossings between the U.S. and Canada. Just that bridge carries approximately 25% of the trade between Canada and the United States.
Yep, exactly.
It's just mind-blowing.
It is.
Something along the line of 10,000 trucks per day and 4,000 autos per day. There's a lot of people and things
A
coming across
lot
that
of
border.
activity. So think about, I mean, the last major interruption most of us would remember was probably 9/11.
Absolutely.
And during the times of 9/11, where there was protocol put in place and all border crossings stopped, but it wasn't for the same period of time that we see today. Policy and procedures caught up fairly quickly to that unique circumstance. And then I think within a week, things were crossing a border again. Now, that doesn't mean that they were crossing without incidents or without hardship, because I think some of us will also remember the lineups of trying to get across the border. Zane's shaking his head saying, yep, because he was probably crossing the border then too. But, for many of us who grew up in the area, who looked to the amenities in Detroit as part of our social life and our playground, certainly that acute stopping at that point was a bit of an interruption in our lifestyles, but nothing like what we've seen with this global pandemic today.
Yeah, it's been huge. Well, you referenced Zane's experience. I think what we want to sort of talk about next is impact on the border of COVID, and
Mhm.
probably no better place to go than Zane to your personal experience. Like you said, you've been crossing this border for 10 years plus, do it in your sleep.
Yeah.
Take us through some of the history. I mean, what was it like before in the last, maybe 2 years, and then what is it like now? How is it changing in recent weeks and months?
Sure. Yeah, so for full disclosure to our listeners, I'm actually a dual citizen. So I live in Canada, I'm a Canadian citizen, but I also hold a US passport, which sometimes makes it a little bit easier for me. But prior to COVID, crossing the border at the Ambassador Bridge especially wasn't too terribly difficult. Most commuters especially are on a Nexus card, which is a US program that sort of allows you for expedited travel. It's the same system that allows for pre-check at the airport. And so usually, you cross the bridge with commercial traffic, and then all the commuters, you might wait maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes if they're slow. But usually you get through in about 10 to 15 minutes on a good day. For example, I can get from my home, which isn't far from the border, on the Windsor side, through Starbucks and to my desk where I'm sitting now in about 20 minutes on a good day, which is fantastic. But the moment that border sort of shut down to non-essential travel, back in, was it spring, would have been, well, March of 2020. Am I getting my dates right? Everything just has come together. Things got really bizarre really quickly. So when healthcare workers found out the border was shutting immediately, they're afraid for their jobs. Thank God, when you read the fine print, the United States still allowed us to cross, which is fantastic. And it was probably the most eerie 4 months or 5 months after that, when really it was only essential workers crossing and very little commercial traffic was crossing. There were mornings when nobody was on that bridge but me, which is insane. Like sometimes I usually leave a little bit later than most of the nurses that cross. So the bulk of the folks were over in Detroit, and it was just me coming across, and it was the weirdest thing.
Probably felt like a Stephen King novel. Sorry, Zane.
Absolutely. And then now that that's evolved, within the last couple of months, some of the traffic starting to return, commercial traffic, things like that. But it's become, I would say, increasingly awkward with, the differing laws in each country and differing requirements for documentation. It's not always clear what I need to produce. And so Canada has what's called the ArriveCan app, where you basically have to make an attestation that you don't have COVID, why you're traveling, when you traveled. And so you complete that. Sometimes they ask us to wear a mask, sometimes they don't. And so for healthcare workers, it's just been very confusing. And then also I would say for our employers here in the United States, all the big health systems, be it Beaumont, Henry Ford, McLaren, DMC, all hire Canadians. They've been petrified that something happens where a significant number of their workforce can't cross. And so we've all been sort of sitting on pins and needles, hoping that everything stays smooth and clear, and it has for the most part. But we're really excited to get out of this and just get back to normal, so we don't have to worry about anything.
Sounds like a lot of the challenge is just the uncertainty of what do I
Correct.
need to bring with me today.
Correct. And that weighs on people. Again, to be honest, I've never been blocked from crossing. Having a healthcare badge, was great, but it's the anxiety of not knowing really hits some people, especially, parents. I have no kids. So if I get stuck in Detroit, whatever, right? I'll, go hang out with Eugene. But for parents who have kids at home and babysitters, they want to make sure they can come home after their shift or come to work and, earn that money so they can take care of their families. And so that anxiety has weighed on a ton of people. And not to, dig in, to politics here, but on the Windsor side in the early days, a lot of our public leaders, in my opinion, made some irresponsible statements and tried to label cross-border healthcare workers as vectors for disease in the community. And that manifested, in my opinion, some bullying and shaming that occurred, especially to the thousands of nurses that cross every day to keep Detroit's hospitals running.
Interesting. Thank you for your perspective.
No problem.
Well, Dr. Levy, you have, as we've said before, you've seen what has been an epicenter with Southeast Michigan in the early days of the pandemic. You've had to manage, both in healthcare settings, these populations of people trying to serve the public good and keep everyone healthy while you're doing it. You've gotten to do it in a microcosm with the movie that you worked on. And of course, we're all familiar with nations who have taken extreme measures. I remember in the early days when I think it was New Zealand shut their border entirely and just completely went, hey, we're not doing anything, no one in, no one out. With all this background of sort of controlling discrete populations, can you give us a medical perspective on considerations when it comes to cross-border healthcare with respect to COVID? With all the water under the bridge, how should we be thinking about this?
Don't you mean water over the tunnel? Gene?
Water over the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think you have to think about it in a phased approach. When we were early on in the pandemic and we did not have vaccines, it made sense to limit contact between people. And if people had to be in contact, that they should wear a mask and that they should socially distance, because the only mechanism we had to prevent the spread of virus was preventing the spread of the virus by not coughing on people, covering your face, right? By not, by washing your hands and whatnot, although we know washing hands is not, the number one way to prevent this. But basically the key is if you keep people who are infected away from those who aren't, you will stop the spread of the virus. And so somewhat draconian measures, shutting down borders and all those things are extremely effective, particularly if the transmission rate in your country or community is very low to start with. If you prevent any further going in, you're gonna decrease the transmission, which is a good thing. It's never going to be 100%. You can't close off every single border as tight as you would want to, although you can certainly try. But now we're in another phase of the pandemic here, and we really have to kind of consider what's the right solution for this time point where we're stutter stepping, if you will, but getting towards that point where we hope to get to 60 to 70% vaccination rates. Who knows when that'll happen, but soon. And so it really is a balance, like we've talked about on the last show. When do you look to move beyond measures that prevent the transmission of infection, to allow commerce to start to resume, to allow some sense of normalization of where we all want to be? And unfortunately, we were talking about some of this before we started, just different perspectives in different nations on vaccinations. And, in the United States, we set very ambitious goals in January when President Biden was inaugurated, which we came close to, with a full force effort across the country. Not quite there. Canada started out of the gate a lot slower than us, but have surpassed us now, because I really do, believe some of this is some of the distinctions between nations, right? Like, Canada it's while it's heterogeneous in its population, maybe to some degrees, maybe not the same as the United States, it's relatively homogeneous in its mindset that it's one nation. Mm-hmm. And, we have a challenge in the United States where we're really two nations right now. And, I'm not saying anything, politically, although, I love to delve into that space. I'm just basically saying, it's hard for us to come together as a nation to do what we want to do to move things forward when we can't even get our own house together. And now you're talking about adding in a border mix. And so, if I'm the Canadians, I don't trust the Americans in all of this equation right now, because, a lot of what's going on is it's not a uniform policy. You're not interacting with one person or one group of people who all have the same mindset. There's a lot of heterogeneity in there. So I guess short answer is the unpredictability of our own country has made it very challenging to come up with I think a cohesive argument or a cohesive discussion around border opening and whatnot. I mean, it doesn't make sense, as we heard before, to have one border have one rule and another border have another rule, even though you're crossing in the same direction. How is how is it even logical, right? But here we're trying to think of it that way. So, I think it's really tough. And if any two countries, should be coming together to figure, any three countries to figure out how we fix this problem, or at least think about how we work together, with very tightly aligned borders. It's the US, Canada, and Mexico. And we were hearing some things before. I don't know if we want to jump into this about, what are some other decisions that go into this, right? It's not always just the epidemiology of what we're talking about. There's some other considerations. So, I think it'd be interesting to hear from Jeannie and perhaps Zain about some of those things that they may be knowledgeable about or whatnot. But at the end of the day, I think each country has to protect the citizens of its own nation, but each country also has to recognize that we're part of a world community, and you can't just only fend for yourself. Although, unfortunately, again, that's a lot of the rhetoric that's coming out.
It's interesting because how a nation ends up having a different policy than another one does come down to some of the things you were talking about. I mean, I think there's a perception that Canada moves a little bit more in lockstep, although there were some concerns raised over maybe how far some of that went. The U.S. tends to be very independent, shall we say. And so it makes sense why you would end up with two different things. I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, but rather it makes sense how you end up with two. If we just gave you the luxury, Dr. Levy, of saying right now at this point, given everything that we knew and the availability of vaccines and the admonition to get them if you're unvaccinated, what would make sense to you if both nations could agree on? Like right now, because you had to manage this in a microcosm, right?
Yeah.
You had to manage this kind of thing in a microcosm. What would you just say, hey, let's do this? If both nations just asked you today, what should we do?
I mean, at risk of getting some nasty responses from participants, I think I would mandate vaccines across the board for everybody, because that's the only way we're going to stop this. And I talked about this a little bit last time, and Zain used the word vector. I used the word host, right? The way to think about this is if we don't stop the virus from replicating, further mutants are going to come out that are going to potentially render the vaccines ineffective. It's just a matter of chance. That's it, right? Every time this virus replicates, and it's going to do millions and billions of times in a person, every time that happens, there's a chance mutation that could arise that could decrease the effectiveness of the vaccines. So, I just think that where we're losing sight in all of this is that piece. We're at a race against time. And we saw it with the Delta. Now we're talking about a Lambda variant, that's coming through, and there's going to be more. So, I think that, the harshest measure will be mandatory vaccinations and no transmission across borders for those who aren't vaccinated, or those who aren't vaccinated, having to show, proof of negative status before they cross over. I mean, that's like the furthest step you could take from all of this. But, as Zain was saying, he comes to work every day in this country, and others are doing that same thing. So how do you have a policy that doesn't take exceptions, right, from one thing or another, doesn't create special subgroups that, don't have to adhere to the same thing, and make it all feasible? I guess the short answer, Gene, I don't really have the right answer for this, because what I want the right answer to be is never going to be. We're never going to get a national vaccine mandate here in this country. Maybe something like that could happen a little more, readily in Canada. But I think the hard part is you can't just wave the wand. Right. And anything like that in today's climate is just not possible. So I know you would like that, but I think if I had to pick one thing I would pick, it would be mandatory vaccinations. Honestly.
Mandatory vaccinations. Yeah, it's interesting. Really, Jeanine, you had a comment there.
Yeah, even in lieu of mandatory vaccinations, if we could agree on both sides of the border, first of all, what is the policy for crossing the border? I don't know about the American side so much, but certainly on the Canadian side, the lack of continuity of information between federal healthcare officials and federal border officials in some cases is lacking. And it can't be that one body makes a decision that has a huge impact on others without any consideration for those impacts. And whether it's increased workload that requires, more and more, in this case, I'll even call it data connections.
Yes.
How do we validate what is what's considered a vaccine versus what's not considered a vaccine. I know right now in Canada, one thing that's of key of mind for those that have been vaccinated is hearing that in certain states, the AstraZeneca vaccine won't be accepted as proof of vaccination. Or, to me, in my mind, just to add to what Dr. Levy said, I think there's some general things that we could start with as a framework and then work out the details as we go. So without mandatory vaccination, for those who are going for vaccination, then what is considered proof of vaccination on both sides of the border? For those who do not want to be vaccinated because they feel it's their freedom of choice, then what are the other responsibilities that you're going to have to take? And whether they're PCR tests, quarantine periods, et cetera, you need to just have full awareness that that will be the impact of your decision. And that may preclude you from being able to participate in things like crossing a border. To me, those are simple things that we can introduce in government, at least right away, to start the discussion on where do we want to go. You know, personally speaking, and maybe more in the tone of why I'm representing here today, is that even the definition of what's an essential worker has not been clear. So from the early days of COVID, we said that manufacturing was an essential service. But unlike healthcare workers that cross the border every day in order to do a shift, in some cases, being in a mandatory setting with your customer means that that might only happen when there's a problem. For manufacturers, this is about servicing equipment. It might be about emergency breakdowns. It might be about going over to assess the readiness of something. And certainly in the case where we have customer sign-offs that can't be done online, you know, the cross-border travel and the allowance of essential workers in manufacturing has not been well identified. And that has caused huge impacts and loss of business, which I think is going to have an impact to our particular industry for more than this next year. I think we have American customers and Canadian customers who are frustrated with the way things have been executed on this side, the lack of information, the lack of continuity, the lack of clarity, and have said, I'm not going to bother. The best alternative for me, like the best supplier for me might be in Canada, but it's a pain in the, you know what?
Yeah.
So I am just going to look for somebody in the US, even if it means it's not going to be great quality. The price point isn't going to be there simply because I don't want to have to deal with this hassle anymore. And that has exaggerated and exacerbated itself to the tune of millions and millions of dollars for at least my two sectors.
Yeah. You know, I'd just validate what Jeanine's saying. So it appears that, especially crossing back into Canada, sort of the decision really rests with that border officer, whether or not your travel was essential. And frankly, some of these guys, or men and women, when I cross, they seem overwhelmed. Like it's almost like making this judgment is beyond, you know, what they're even paid to do. And so I feel bad for them. But we've even had cases within the healthcare industry where contingent workers, so folks who don't work every day, or folks who can work remote for a few days, when they don't show a regular pattern of crossing, they get nabbed either in Canada or the United States. And then, you know, at one point, you know, one of our nurses was asked to go in quarantine in Toronto, and she busted out crying because her kids are in Windsor, right? And so it's that, I guess it's that level of not thinking through all the possibilities that, to Dr. Levy's point, makes sort of these overarching policies not always work for those that live in these cross-border regions.
Well, and I think too, yeah, sorry, Jean, I didn't want to cut you off there, but so our group we've been doing a concurring survey analysis of the border constraints, border issues within the manufacturing community. And what we're hearing even is at the same border crossing with two employees that are coming from the same company that are getting two different border agents. And again, this is not about bashing our border agents. This is about a lack of policy and lack of communication and lack of consistency, but they will get two different answers. Two employees crossing at exactly the same time, two different border agents were over for exactly the same reason. One is asked to quarantine, the other is told, yep, that's okay, go back to work.
So it's really interesting because you've got these inconsistencies, and you've also got different types of people. I think you both alluded to that. Some are crossing every day, some who don't, and the ones who don't have to cross every day, the ones who do are thinking about it a lot, so it's on their mind. It's a hassle, it's a pain, but they're thinking about it a lot. The ones who don't have to cross every day may just say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go do that. It's not worth it to
Yep.
go service that client
Yep.
or do whatever else. Stacy had her hand up here. I think she might have some thought, insight, or question.
Well, I do. I was just wondering from all the panelists, we understood that the US government had kind of a pandemic playbook, if you will, that kind of got tossed aside apparently in this pandemic. But from a policy perspective, a healthcare perspective, and a supply chain or logistics or economics perspective, do any of you know of any work collectively that's being done to be better prepared in the future? I mean, we've heard that these types of super viruses and bugs, could become more prevalent. And it seems to me that we as countries, we as a global, economy, need to do better to prepare and plan for future events and acknowledge the lessons learned from this. So really, for all of you, from your own perspective positions, are you seeing this planning process, or are we just too far in the weeds right now to even think about the next thing?
Well, I'm happy to jump in first. I think not only are we, maybe I think we're too far divided at this point to really think about what is the next planning. We can't even admit if this virus is real in our country. We have, a portion of this country who thinks it's a hoax until they get about to get put on a ventilator, which is absurd, right? And you have people who are trained medical professionals who are not taking the vaccine because they don't believe in it, which is just unbelievable. I can't wrap my head around that. And so what we've done in this country, when all of the first talk started coming out, the anthrax cases and all that stuff years ago, and we realized that bioterrorism was a real problem potentially in the future. And this isn't bioterrorism. I don't want to mistake anybody on this, who's listening in thinking that's what I'm saying. But the point is that we created a system to have pandemic preparedness in place, and we thought we were done. We hung it up. It was great. And then when we dusted off the FEMA tents and everything, when COVID started, we realized we had outdated PPE. We didn't have all the right equipment. We had no preparedness to even understand how would we start testing people at mass scale. Right. And then you had a president who didn't want to test people because it's like, the way to drive down a pregnancy rate is to have fewer pregnancy tests. Right. So, it's crazy. So what we need to do is at least come together and say we can't allow this type of political division around a pandemic in the future. I think if we could just agree to that general principle, that would be huge. But and I'm not trying to be negative on the whole situation, but we need to get to what you're saying. We can't let history here ever repeat itself. And I'm very fearful that it might do it sooner than we want if we don't stop the virus from replicating. Because God forbid a variant comes out that the vaccines are not effective against, we're back to square one. And I'm not trying to be alarmist, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with right now. We shouldn't be where we're at right now, knowing that we have vaccinations, honestly.
Well, and I think, on the, at least on the Canadian side, I'm not going to speak for the government outright, but it is troublesome to us that when there is a request for further information, they're not getting any further definition of what essential worker is out. And my suspicion is that's likely because they are so busy, like you said, Stacy, in the weeds. They're dealing with crisis day to day. My greater fear is, though, once we get this under control and we get to a place where, trade is happening, the economy is back on track, do we ever go back and do, what we're tasked with doing in other industries when we have a problem, is going back and doing a deep dive in the lessons learned and, being able to put protocol and policy in place that takes into account not only the things that we didn't expect to experience, but the things that we did, and we had a plan and it didn't work. And further to that, who do we involve in those discussions? Those discussions cannot happen in isolation. They need to happen with multiple points of interest that experienced setback or experienced problems due to the fact that there was a lack in policy or a policy that it was written that had no bearing whatsoever on the circumstance. So that's my greater fear. I mean, aside from the immediate, is what about the future?
Yeah, I agree with Jeanine. And, one of my biggest frustrations, seeing decisions that the Ontario government made and the Canadian federal government is I realize I'm nobody in their eyes, but I wish they would have just picked up the phone, like and called us and, hey, what's your perspective on what's going on? Because living in a cross-border region is so nuanced in the rest of the province. Like you can't even pretend to imagine what it's like living in Toronto or Ottawa. So I would hope that as we do sort of that, if we can go back and look at what are all the mistakes, where are all the bright spots, that they actually involve people who lived it and can potentially solution for the next pandemic.
Well, and if I could add, I'm sorry, Jean, I keep cutting you
No, you're
off. I
fine.
don't know if there's a
that's
lag
great.
time there.
You're fine.
I'm going to have my virtual hand slapped here anytime. I think the other thing to consider here is, do we count on the government to drive all of this? And that's been a conversation that is kind of come full circle. For our particular industry, we decided that in lieu of having decisions made or clarity provided, that we would go and find it. And so for anybody who's in the manufacturing community in Canada right now, we have produced a Crossing the Border handbook. And it does take into account all of the subtle nuances and things to pay attention to your point, Zain, in documentation. So from our perspective, having it all together and over planning in the event of crossing the border seems to be, even though it's a pain in the arse, to do ahead of time, has alleviated some of these challenges that we may face either crossing into the US or coming back into Canada. And that's readily available on a number of partners' websites, including Automate Canada and CAM. So I encourage folks that, are looking for some answers and guidance, that they can use that as a template. But to the greater good here, do we as industry, as sector groups, as organized people with a common approach or a common problem, look to aid the government by helping to define these things? Because quite frankly, they don't have feet on the street, and they're not probably participating in the activities we participate in every day.
Well, that's a concern, Jeanine, because you're right. I don't think the government should be the one really leading the charge. And I keep waiting for private industry to step up and say, here is what we are going to demand, because we're seeing our workforce now is divided. Mm-hmm. We're seeing our workforce, we have half of our workforce unwilling to come back to work until they are confident the rest of their coworkers are vaccinated or safe. We're seeing different sectors have different outcomes or ideas of what would be considered success. And there's no real standardized. And to what Zain said, if they're not asking the people that are actually living this every day, and this is just a bunch of policymakers sitting behind a desk determining this sounds good, we're in deep, deep trouble, and we're not going to be prepared for the next. So I'm sorry, that wasn't really a question. It was just a thought. But I do worry about that. And I do really hope that private industry is going to start to step in and play a larger role.
Absolutely.
Really interesting. Oh, go ahead, Phil. Yep.
I'm just going to quickly jump in and, coming full circle to your initial question, Jean, about the movie, the Screen Actors Guild has actually been one of the most advanced of all the private industry or advocacy groups, if you will, in terms of saying this is what the standards are and nothing short of this will be accepted. And so when we designed our approach to working or creating the bubble for the movie industry, it had to adhere to the Screen Actors Guild requirements or it wasn't going to get done. And, that's a very important thing to consider, because the actors are unprotected because they can't do filming, with face masks on, although that would be an interesting thing unto itself. But, right. But anyway, so
I think you have a directorial debut in your future there.
Yeah, exactly. Rip the mask off with fervor. But in any event, I thought that was a good example because they knew they had a mission to do, and they knew that, and maybe finances drove it, right? They don't want to get actors sick, but every day that a movie gets shut down, 14 days for quarantines or whatever is a huge, huge cost. And so, you can do it the right way. You just have to be thoughtful and think about the people who are going to be impacted by the decisions and work with them to determine acceptability. And as you guys said, none of that was done here, right? Nobody Nobody thought of that, and nobody thought of the poor border guards, right? I mean, we all love to, malign them because, they're doing their job with some self-interpretation, right? But at the same point, nobody talked to them about how they're all of a sudden going to go from being people who enforce one thing to enforcing another, or all of these poor clerks in stores or restaurants that are getting shot, and, people are yelling at them for things that they're only trying to do what they're told. Right. And all of a sudden you're making them enforcers of something that they don't even understand the policy. And so, I think that's the challenge, right? It's just, it's this, not that we don't want free will, right? But it's the free will component of our society that makes it so difficult to tell people what they should or shouldn't do.
This is a really fascinating point, though, and I appreciate you all for bringing it out, because what I'm seeing emerging here is it's hard, and hopefully I say this right, it's hard on a national level where you're trying to create sort of a fair and open playing field for your population and people of all different, lots of diversity, right? But in an industry, and I think maybe this is why I've always been so impressed with the one anecdote, Dr. Levy, of what you did in the microcosm of the film industry. There is a vested interest there. It's not acceptable to pack up and go home, and it's not acceptable to just run willy-nilly. You have to find something that works inside of a boundary of parameters, because there is a vested interest there. And I think what we're hearing from all of you uniformly is industries with enough of a vested interest to say we can't take either of these extremes. We have to find something that works, that's functional, that's clear. We got another note from John Mark here saying, yeah, it's just the changes all the time. That's what's really, really hard to deal with. I mean, this is a really interesting emergent thing for me that I certainly wasn't thinking beforehand. This idea of let those with the vested interest try to create uniformity for their subpopulations. Sounds like Automate Canada's been doing that. The link there posted in the chat. That's going to be a takeaway for me for today. I think it's a very, very interesting
Well, and
concept.
let me also say that, it's important then when you make these, let's call them aids, that whether industry or people at large decide to come together and plug those holes, it's still important to make sure that the information is vested within those groups, right? So we have had a lot of calls with CBSA particularly, and with something we call PHAC, which is our Provincial Health Association, to make sure that, whatever guides that we're putting in place there are still aligned with, their policy, and that we're not contravening anything. But the challenge still lies in the fact that depending on who you speak to at what level, you might get a slightly different answer on exactly what should be in there. And so I think there is great opportunity for industries or aligned people to coordinate this and make a decision where there's subjectivity about what is right for their environment, and put it down so that everyone is practicing the same. And at a minimum, there's some consistency across a sector or across a large group. In case in point, the film industry, we saw a lot of this, particularly we have similar challenges when you have a person who has some expertise in the tooling or automation industry that is sent across the border to do work and then has to quarantine for 14 days when they come back to Canada. That has incredible disruption and financial impact to the manufacturer that they happen to work with too. So it's not, I would say there's probably similarities across every sector.
Another example of, the industry coming up with its own solution is in healthcare, especially obviously in the Detroit-Windsor region. There are many nurses who actually work in both countries. And so they work part-time at maybe Windsor Regional or Health-to-Do, and then come and work for Beaumont, Henry Ford, you name it. And a great solution that came up, that emerged, is actually Windsor Regional made the decision that they would only allow their staff to work in one hospital. So you either pick you're working in Windsor or you're working in Detroit. And what was beautiful is a hospital over here in Detroit actually reciprocated that and said, listen, if you choose to stay in Windsor, even though you work part-time for us, we will honor your employment here. And when you feel free to come back, no harm done. And so I really appreciated that at least the hospital systems reached out across and supported one another, just to stop, transmission between, Canadian department to the other American equivalent, which I thought was fantastic. But when you talk about, a vested interest, I want to call out that in Detroit, up to 40% of shifts are staffed by Canadians. And so there are not enough qualified nurses in Michigan to run Detroit Region's hospitals. And so if it wasn't for Windsorites continue to cross, Detroit would be in a very precarious position at fighting this pandemic. And so I'm glad it stayed open, and we need to keep working together, especially in healthcare, to keep people free flowing and crossing.
And that's a
Those
great
are-
example, Zane, of making a policy that everybody can adhere to. And I think as an employer now, who's going to do what, so
Yep.
that I can staff accordingly or shut down departments that are, not considered essential for the time being in order to manage my business a little bit better. But the lack of knowing makes it very, very difficult.
Absolutely.
And Zane, to that point too, the way the American hospitals were able to vaccinate Canadian nurses coming across as part of their pool, but we
Yes.
couldn't vaccinate any other Canadian who came across. I mean, let's be serious. We're this close on the border.
Yeah.
That could have been a smart way to advance industry to say, if you have to
Absolutely.
cross the border, why don't we work together to vaccinate
Yeah.
people? We had them, but we didn't, right? Because they were our our vaccines to let go to waste in freezers because they're unused, not
Yeah.
your vaccines.
Yeah.
Well,
Well-
and I think, there was a lot of talk on this side of the border from some Canadian mayors about, why can't we do this? And I think when you're an employer and you have employee records that you can keep track of and maintain the confidentiality around, that makes sense. For the public at large, I think the logistics side of this on how to do this, how do you share health information, like what's the protocol?
Yeah.
I think I'm not suggesting it couldn't be done, Dr. Levy. I'm just saying that I think the answer involved a lot more planning and a lot more questions being answered than anybody was prepared to take on.
So-
I think you're right. I'll just say this, we've been doing this for a while. The information we ask around testing and all the stuff we did before was far more extensive than the vaccination. It's like 5 questions, sign the form, bring your card back. And so we certainly could have come up with a way for industry's sake. I think the general population is different, but if you talk about the essentiality of the cross-border, traffic and everything, we could have thought of this a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, a solution to this would have been just a straightforward sale of the vaccine. Right? Sell it from one healthcare provider to another healthcare provider with all the government bells and whistles in place and be done with it instead of having things go to waste. But that's a layperson's simplistic view of things. So I'll leave that with you there.
As someone who,
It's interesting. Steve from our team here just shot me a link to the Manitoba and North Dakota joint vaccine border program. Is anyone familiar with that?
There you go.
Absolutely. So as someone who was leading vaccination clinics here in Michigan through this pandemic, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, setting up these clinics is not as simple as you might read about in the news by some of our public leaders. There's a lot that goes into it. The biggest issue, in my view, would have been figuring out where does the protected health information stay in which country, because there are laws that prevent that from happening. And then thirdly, the real reason why I think it really didn't work is just the optics of one country not being able to help its own citizens and vice versa. I think scared the politicians from coming to a bigger solution, especially here in Windsor, Detroit. That's my opinion.
Good. We've got about 3 minutes left here. I want to leave time for one audience question if there are any hands to be raised out there in Zoom land. And while we're waiting to see that, I want to go back to one point that you had made, Zain. I wish they'd picked up the phone and called me. And it's so funny because longtime listeners of our show know that we're not talking about COVID, we're talking about MedTech, right? We're talking about medical device development and life sciences development. User needs, like everything drives from user needs. If you don't know what the user needs, you can't develop a successful product. And I think we're just seeing that same principle back here. And it's very interesting today, though, coming out of this, I certainly before today was not thinking, hey, let's let those with vested interests do it, like Dr. Levy with the film industry, like you see Automate Canada putting out their own handbook. Let's try to see where the needs are by those who are already looking at their group's needs.
And Jean, really quick, as somebody who works with the entrepreneurial community in MedTech, we've got a breadth across the border, both sides of the border, of really smart entrepreneurial minds. And if we have problems to solve, let's get them out there and let's get solutions and let's cut the bureaucracy to it. And let's just help get these solutions to market and work on solving these problems. So that my mind always goes right there. We're waiting for, bureaucrats to solve problems, but we have the talent in the region to do this. So, tap those minds as well, and let's utilize the brain power that we really have.
Well, and I would
Absolutely.
encourage those that are looking to develop something, like, feel free to use the template that was created mostly by Invest Windsor Essex on behalf of the manufacturing community, because I'm sure they were the ones that were getting the brunt of the phone calls, but it has been developed in partnership. But I would say use it as a template to, do your own thing, particularly in that startup community. And we have startup resources on both sides. We have a number of agencies that work in that space. Get together and develop something.
Good admonition. Well, our time today is up. I want to thank Dr. Phil Levy, Jeanine Lassaline-Berglund, and Zain Ismail, and of course, Stacy Frankovich. Always thank you for being here and being part of our chat today. There you see the Detroit-Windsor skyline and all its nighttime beauty. Hopefully we can make that border continue to thrive.
Thanks for having us, Gene.
Appreciate each one of you.
Thanks,
And
Gene.
appreciate our audience today. In the month of August, we're going to be turning our attention back to the world of MedTech and the world of manufacturing. So don't forget to join us and send folks over for the pitch party coming up in September. Thank all of our panelists today and each one of you for being here. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll see you on the other side of it. Bye-bye.